Most of you who've been through to my talks know that as I research them, sometimes I find kind of unusual things. In this case, it was a tie. So I'm wearing a tie today. It's a miracle. So, okay, here we go. Portugal, during the war, relatively unknown. I'm going to give you folks a nice quick overview today of several aspects of Portugal during the war. Basically, and the reason I'm jumping into this is because of that man. To answer who he is, let me tell you a story from World War II. Back on November 30th, 1943, a US PB-4Y-1, a naval version of the B-24, used for ocean patrol, crashed into the sea about 6 miles south of Faro, capital of Portugal's Algarve province. They were out of fuel after a navigation error. 5 of the 11-man crew were killed in the crash, 6 survived. The wreck was discovered in 2007. Anyhow, so the plane goes down. Nearby is a 15-foot unmotorized fishing boat. In it were fishermen Jaime Nunes and Jose Mascarenhas and Jose's 13-year-old son Manuel. They immediately abandoned their nets and rowed to the plane, which is in the water, about to go down, and climbed in, rescuing the 6 survivors of the 11-man crew. They gave the men their limited food and clothing while rowing back to that spot in Faro. And if you notice, the pharmacia is in the background where they were treated, later being taken to a convent for convalescence. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy representative who was in town changed the official location of the crash. This would make it easier for the airmen to be repatriated later. The flyers eventually made it back to their Moroccan home base, but Jaime and Jose were never reimbursed for anything, including their lost catch. The story faded, but in July of '99, a Faro journalist arranged for Jaime Nunes to be honored for his actions that night. Unfortunately, both Jose and Manuel Mascarenhas had died by that time. Michael Pease, a British expatriate living in the Algarve, got wind of that ceremony, but felt more was needed. On his own, with no relation to either the fishermen or the U.S. Navy, he decided he'd begin an attempt to build a life-size bronze statue to memorialize both that incident and all Portuguese who saved lives during the war. It will be placed in Faro right there. He only needs about $100,000 to pull this together. I visited Michael and his wife Jill this year in Portugal and told them I'd help tell that tale and the larger tale of their adopted country during the war. But we can't talk about Portugal during World War II and not talk about Britain. A free Britain was critical to winning the European war. Could the Axis have neutralized them? Barring an invasion, it would be a death of 1,000 cuts, and one potential slice would be Portugal. So let's sort of explore early war Europe. By July 1940, Axis forces had occupied or neutralized most of Western Europe, including France, the Low Countries, and Norway. Right? The summer of fall of 41 sees German forces running rampant against Russia. If needed, Spain and Portugal were also ripe for plucking. In April of '39, Portugal had been invited to join Germany, Italy, and Japan in the Anti-Comintern Pact, but declined. Spain also stayed away. Given the importance of Gibraltar, Operation Felix, an invasion plan for the Iberian Peninsula, was actually developed to help shut down Britain's supply lines. So, if implemented, Felix would almost certainly succeed, possibly resulting in, I love these what ifs, By the way, folks, in November 41, 60% of Axis supplies heading to North Africa were lost, mostly to Malta-based forces. 60%. Besides control of the Med, we'll look at other reasons for an Iberian invasion. But first, let's explore Portugal itself. Its global presence was managed by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, the country's dictator from 1932 to 68. And dictator he was. But he recognized Portugal's weakness and lack of industry. He capitalized on its geographic, colonial, and historic strengths early on, playing both sides. Thus, Portugal punched above its weight on the global stage. Significant were the country's tungsten mines. Processed into wolfram, tungsten hardened German steel. Salazar didn't question the source of the German gold that paid for that tungsten, however. But Portugal's most critical assets, at least in a World War setting, were its Atlantic islands, particularly the Azores. This was fully appreciated by the German High Command. Early on, Hitler proposed an Azores invasion, but the Kriegsmarine recognized they couldn't be held. Just the idea, though, that Hitler proposed an invasion reminds us of the proportion of Germany's air and especially naval effort expended on Great Britain, whose survival depended upon continuous oceanic supply. Traffic was dense, with at least one convoy being received daily. Britain's lifelines were four principal sea routes. The northern route, passing south of Greenland and Iceland, heading into Liverpool and the Clyde. The longer southerly route, coming past South America, then over to Freetown and up. The route north from Cape Town, South Africa, bringing supplies from the Indian Ocean countries and Australasia, then joining up with the other convoys. And finally, the Mediterranean traffic from Africa with oil from the Mideast also, which joined northbound routes. Compare this map to the Azores strategic location. Oops, wrong talk. Sorry. So now, in addition to the Med, we see another facet to Portugal's importance. After the fall of France, Admiral Karl Dönitz established 5 U-boat bases around the Bay of Biscay. 123 fortified submarine pens were established at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux. The Luftwaffe supported U-boat operations from a base at Marignac, near Bordeaux, down here. Dönitz stressed the U-boat campaign. He felt it the most effective way to remove Britain from the war, thus allowing total focus on Russia. The possibility gave Churchill fits. If Churchill had only known of Hitler's quirks. Hitler was not versed in naval power nor willing to be educated. He didn't prioritize U-boats and misused those he had. He obsessively committed some to defend Norway. Remember, he kept 400,000 soldiers in Norway right through to the end. Also, the Russian front drained supplies. Allied bombing hampered U-boat construction, repair, and modification. As a final insult, Dönitz complained that German intelligence, the Abwehr, failed him. Not surprising, given that Hitler hater Wilhelm Canaris was in charge. But Allied intelligence was also spotty, regarding the German Navy especially. Britain had to proceed through much of the war as though the U-boat campaign might ramp up any time. This meant applying pressure and calling in some very old markers. The Treaty of Windsor in 1373 formalized an alliance between Britain and Portugal, cemented by the wedding of Portugal's King John I to Philippa of Lancaster in 1387. The treaty was invoked during the Napoleonic Wars. Britain used Portugal as a staging area to successfully campaign against Napoleon in the Iberian Peninsula. Understanding of Portugal's huge geographic significance to Britain's navy and trade led British Prime Minister Canning to note, in 37 and 38, both the British and Germans sent military missions to Portugal, especially the Azores. But the British mission included military supplies, strengthening the ties. Once war started, however, and despite repeated demands, Salazar just waited. Meanwhile, everyone headed to Portugal. Lisbon, especially an open Atlantic port, was a hotbed of intrigue. I want to digress from the diplomatic battle to control the Azores to touch on Lisbon, Portugal's capital. Intelligence officers from every country rubbed shoulders around town. Espionage ground zero was the Palacio Estoril. During the war, there were as many as 50 intelligence agencies operating in town. By the way, Casablanca, where are they headed? To board the plane to Lisbon, right? Everybody's headed to Lisbon. There were official spies and an army of freelance amateurs, waiters, cleaners, taxi drivers, and shopkeepers who watched and listened and reported to whomever was paying the highest. In 43, a U.S. report noted that, quote, a remarkably high proportion of the population were involved. Spy fever gripped Lisbon. The elite of the spies were the double agents. Most faded away post-war, but not Garbo, whose exploits came to life post-war. Born in Spain and a former lieutenant in the Spanish Republican Army, he was looking for a role to play in World War II. He wanted to be a British spy. However, their embassy in Madrid rejected him. But he really didn't like fascists. So what's a guy to do? He contacts the Abwehr, who invite him to spy for them and send him to Portugal. After scoping the place out, he returns to Madrid and spins another story. If he just had supplies, code books, and money, he could operate for Britain. But he didn't go to Britain. He just stayed in Lisbon and made it seem like his reports were from Britain. He bought English maps and guidebooks and an English-French military phrasebook because he didn't speak English. But he convinced the Abwehr that he could operate from Britain. So from Lisbon, he's forwarding fake information about the Allied war effort. One false report about a British fleet assembling in Malta results in Axis ships attempting an intercept because the Abwehr believe him. This finally rouses British MI6 to his work. They didn't even know about him. He's helping the Allied effort, and MI6 is clueless about it. Except, wait a minute, what are these guys going after? They're headed to go intercept this fleet in Malta? So British MI6 thinks that they've uncovered a new German spy. He continued freelancing from Lisbon and later presented himself at the American embassy there, which led to a long delayed meeting with MI6, and they invite him finally to come and work from Britain. So come on over. He does. And there in Britain, he builds a fictional network of spies. The Brits give him morsels of quality information to feed to the Germans, improving his credibility. By 1944, he was among the most trusted of all German agents. Partly that's because the Abwehr wasn't very effective, but that's another talk. However, the Abwehr did infiltrate Portuguese life, it's not hard, from government departments to brothels on Pink Street. But then everybody kept brothels. Great place to get information. The Abwehr bugged the foreign ministry and even Salazar's office. bribed officials and had a much wider network than the British, considering they paid 10 times what the British were. But here's another double. Dusan Duško Popov, aka Tricycle, a gambler with expensive tastes. Popov was a successful Yugoslavian commercial lawyer with genuine business interests in both London and Lisbon. A regular at the Palacios Casino, the Aber thought he was theirs. But in reality, he was so effective of double agent, he was later tasked with obtaining info from Canaris about the plans to depose Hitler. There were all sorts of famous folks running around Lisbon. You may have heard of MI6's 1941 Iberian branch chief and Popov's immediate boss, Kim Philby. Turns out he was a double agent too, but for the Soviet Union. One last quick story has Lisbon double agent Paul Friedemuck, aka Ostro, receiving and passing on the obviously false story that the D-Day landings would take place on the Cherbourg Peninsula. But the Germans took no action on that because they were giving more credence to Garbo's reports that Normandy would just be a diversion from the real invasion at Calais. Good. There's a reason Garbo is considered the most effective spy of the war. Anyway, while all this intrigue is churning in Lisbon, diplomatic links between the Portuguese and the Allies became pivotal. Who would control the Azores? The Germans had shelved Operation Felix in 1941 as the Russian campaign bogged down, but Salazar would keep everybody at arm's length for just a little longer. Control of the Azores remained a running sore. Let's take another look at why everybody wanted them. It's called location, location, location. So there they are, lying toward the mid-Atlantic, 950 miles from Portugal. There are 9 islands in 3 groups. Some cold warriors here may know Santa Maria Island, closest to continental Europe. With the longest runway in the world, it was vital to the Berlin airlift and later global operations. The 5 middle islands include Terceira, where the critically important Lagash air base would be constructed in 1943. German submariners secretly put into the islands coves for minor repairs. Churchill just wanted access to the islands, damn it. Churchill begged Roosevelt to order carrier-based reconnaissance flights to help safeguard British convoys near the island until hopefully Salazar gave him access. Those convoys had to be protected. By the way, historians in the room may know who devised the convoy system. Thankfully, the British ambassador, Sir Ronald Campbell, established close links with Salazar. In late 1942, the United Kingdom sent an undercover, high-level military mission to Lisbon, which paved the way for Allied use of the Azores and was especially important as Salazar did not trust America. There was no governing treaty for any relationship, and he feared the U.S. would pry Portugal and her possessions apart post-war. But Salazar was becoming more comfortable with the establishment of bases on the Azores by the British. Finesse was obviously needed. The Allies' hand needed delicate play if Portugal was to stay neutral, given the right-wing leanings of Salazar and much of the Portuguese military. American charge d'affaires George Kennan regarding the Azores were challenged by the American Joint Chiefs, who, like Churchill, pressed for an indelicate, arbitrary takeover of the islands. They found it difficult to grasp the concept, much less the significance, of a treaty in force for 600 years. We've discussed German, British, and American moves in the game. Let's look at how Portugal played. Late in 1940, Portuguese Air Force officer Humberto Delgado made the first of several covert missions to Britain, supposedly developing a training scheme for Portuguese pilots. During these visits, Delgado met with Wing Commander Ronald Ventris of RAF Intelligence. This resulted in a number of quiet visits to the Azores by Delgado and Ventris from 1940 to 1943. The purpose, to determine an airstrip location and prepare for its eventual construction. Delgado would eventually win an OBE, Order of the British Empire, for risking his Portuguese military career by banking on the Allies in the early days of the war, balking against his country's official neutrality. After Axis' surrender in North Africa convinced him of ultimate Allied victory, Salazar finally acquiesced and signed a use agreement on August 18, 1943. Additionally, South Africa and Australia had given notice to him they would resist post-war impacts to Portugal's colonial possessions in Africa and the Far East. After the signing, Axis nationals on the Azores were either interned or expelled. Supplies started arriving, much of which was arranged by Azorean Joe Ben Saad. Joe had earlier moved to New York. There he got to know Bill Donovan, who was headquartered in the Rockefeller Center. Ben Saad established a strong intelligence network, particularly focused on maritime traffic through on-ship agents. Because this survey work had been set up by Delgado and Vintras from 40 to 43, all right, what was then the longest runway in the airport, the Lagos Airfield on Terceira, became operational in early September 1943. Its principal runway was 3,200 meters long, constructed of interlocking steel strips called Marston matting. By the way, folks, if you go to Normandy, you can find this stuff in fields. All right, when the Allies landed and made those initial landing strips for their planes and stuff like that to support the effort, you know, it's interesting. You're just driving down a country road in Normandy, and off to the side, there's a bunch of Marston matting sitting in the field. Anyhow, this stuff was made in the U.S. and transported there by Ben Saad, done under the code name Operation Alacrity. Actually, the Americans were initially only allowed use of the port facilities on the basis that they were friends of friends. Because remember, the Portuguese were like, yeah, Americans, no. British, we understand, we got a treaty, but yeah. But finally, the British were allowed to use the Lagos Airfield base, and they could extend air surveillance into the Atlantic, now for a radius of 800 miles. On October 19th, 1943, the RAF, flying American B-17s, commenced sorties, and the first U-boat kill occurred in November. Lagos Airfield, there's a PB-4Y-1 sitting on Lagos Airfield, proved a major factor in decisively shifting the Battle of the Atlantic in favor of the Allies. The technology used to hunt subs from airplanes, which my friend Eric Rivette touched on a few weeks ago. You might have been here for the technology of the Battle of the Atlantic. Well, the technology used to hunt subs from planes could only be deployed if the planes could reach the subs. However, while the Azorean Portuguese military commander accepted the British presence under the terms of the Treaty of Windsor, 600 years old, he was prepared to use force if necessary to attempt to prevent American usage. All right? And in fact, the British commander, Air Marshal Bromett, was asked by the Portuguese to act in unison with them to repel the Americans if the Americans attempted an invasion. So obviously things need to be sort of smoothed out. A little delicacy is needed. But it was. And American Seabees landed and extended the Lagos airstrip in late 43. By the end of December 43, U.S. Navy and transport commands were operating a regular service, and Lagos Air Base played a significant supporting role in Operation Overlord. Salazar had successfully played his country's hand by irritating everyone. So kind of to wrap up here, we've got a nice short presentation. I'll get you guys out to lunch. Portuguese independence from Axis control was important to espionage, Mediterranean actions, and the Battle of the Atlantic. Most critically, the last. The fact that Germany did not hold Portugal's Azores Islands meant that their U-boats had to suffer while traversing the Bay of Biscay. That's amazing.
What are the different color back?
That I don't know. Michael Pease does, and I can find out for you. However, they still inflicted enormous damage, majorly responsible for the loss of over 2,700 Allied merchant ships, 30,000 men. Note the losses in 42 before Lagash Airfield activated. But it did. Salazar came around to our side and prevented, and there's Winston one more time chiming in to remind us all of the importance of this battle that sometimes we don't give enough credence to. Very quick overview of Portugal during World War II, folks. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Well, when the British started establishing bases, when the Germans, seems like they would try to block that or do something about it.
They had no ability to contest naval operations mid-Atlantic, if that's what you're referring to. Like going out into the Azores and stuff like that. Right, the Kriegsmarine was done at that point. I mean, the Bismarck had been sunk, the Tirpitz was bottled up in the fjords in Norway. There was no ability for the German Navy to sortie out and contest British or American naval operations at that point. They really, the Allied naval efforts, especially the British against the German fleet, were just impeccable during the war. They never, other than the U-boats, developed a significant threat.
So did they bring some U-boats into the Azores?
The U-boat campaign went all through the Atlantic, even into the Gulf, and down to the Caribbean, hitting the South American routes, even stuff like that. They'd put into the Azores for minor repairs, into the coves and stuff like that. Maybe getting some supplies from people there, might sell them some food or something. But I mean, there was no significant German presence in the Azores, although there easily could have been if Salazar had decided to, throw in with them. It would have meant that Britain and later America would be diverting naval power to prevent, or to interdict the German use of those bases. So that's one reason why it's so important. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Good. Yes, sir.
The American relationship with Portugal must have improved because we had an Air Force base at Lodges Field. That's where I went to the first grade.
Yep.
And,
wow.
And we've got still an Air Force base there. So why today? I mean, we re-upped the lease, and I'm wondering why we still have an air base there.
Critical location.
Yeah, we're location. I mean, it's an amazingly strategic spot mid-ocean, for what refueling or anything like that. Even in these days when we can cross the globe without it, it certainly helps. Plus, I'm guessing that there's an amount of money going into the Portuguese economy that makes it worthwhile. They're one of the PIC countries, right? Or is it big countries? Yeah, so unfortunately, Portugal's economy is suffering right now.
First comment I'll make is anytime I've ever gone through the Pillars of Hercules or the entrance to the Mid, I've seen at least 30 to 100 ships.
Right.
Right there. At any time there night, there are that many ships there.
Right.
So the entrance to the Mediterranean is critical for us if we wish to project power into Europe.
Absolutely.
Right? The second thing is that we must never forget that the Spanish and want Gibraltar back the worst way, and the Brits aren't going to give it to them. And we have a very delicate role to play in that if you have a ship on leave, shore leave in Tangier, and you send a helicopter to get the mail, he may not go to Gibraltar in the same flight that he goes to get the mail down at Lisboa
Right.
are out of Rota, Spain. There are other two places we get mail.
Right?
So even today, everybody ain't real happy over who controls the entrance. And I would say sensibly that any amount of money you give Portugal under the guise of rent or whatever is probably money very well spent.
Right?
Because remember, we want that Atlantic Ocean to be Mare Nostrum.
Yep.
And yeah, you could base a lot of things at sea, but on aircraft carriers, well, you only got 10 or 11 of them left in the world. Those airfields on the Azores look mighty attractive to put a few Air Force squadrons or whatever you might need to do to discourage someone from causing trouble for you in one of the choke points.
Absolutely. There's
One of the reasons that we have trouble in the Red Sea is that we lack a stable base like Portugal right now there. We've shot at it in Ethiopia and
okay.
had several wars there, many
Right.
wars that we don't talk about because we didn't win them.
I was going to say that when my wife and I were recently over in Portugal, we went up to one of the highest spots, an area called the Monchique, which is just inland from the southern coast. And at this one spot, that the sky's gorgeously clear, and you can see for like 30, 40 miles out into the water. And festooning the top of that mountain are radar platforms, and who knows what's in that rock, you know. But you're right; it controls the entrance, or it controls the pre-entrance, if you will. It's right there. So it's controlling the pre-entrance. Yes, sir.
This is maybe a little off topic, but it seems that Franco was in the same situation that Salazar was.
Right.
And Hitler was not able to prevail on him to shut down Gibraltar. That was the same kind of issue.
Right, same kind of thing. You know, it's interesting because Gibraltar is so, but it's so valuable to the Spanish also to not have it in the German hands. I mean, once it's taken, so say Felix goes through, now what card does Spain have to play? You know, there's so very wise on both of these, gentlemen's parts to sort of like, yeah, we'll play along with you, and thanks for loaning us, a lot of stuff to beat back, the Spanish Civil War, the other forces, but but you got your training out of it, and now everybody just leave us alone, but give us money.
They're deadly serious about Gibraltar, Spain, because right now, for an American sailor on Liberty, you can go on Liberty all in Europe without a passport. Because we're all in NATO.
Yep.
And if he goes into La Linea, he don't come out to get back to the ship very easy, because they'll hold him up 8 or 12 hours or until the ambassador calls.
Right.
They don't recognize the English, and don't go there.
Right.
And they just play where you don't do it.
That makes sense. If you've got a good strategic card in your hand, you want to. Right. So, anybody else? Okay.
In that movie Casablanca, they made it so difficult to get out of, to get to Lisbon.
Right.
To go to Lisbon.
Right.
Was it difficult getting out of North Africa?
There's actually, it's really interesting because Garbo acquired an Argentinian visa to allow him to go to Lisbon. He was not able to just, obtain one on his own recognizance coming from Spain to Lisbon. He had to, I have no idea how he acquired it, but he did. He acquired an Argentinian visa, and that, so there's all sorts of circuitous things, If I'd been born back then, I think being a forger in Lisbon in, 39, 40, 41 would have been I'd be set if I wasn't dead. So, but I can't imagine all the goings on that were happening there. It's really cool. I hope somebody maybe does like that. It seems to me it'd make a great movie, So
Salazar and Franco, what was their relationship?
I think they don't like it. The countries don't like each other. I'm sure there was some antagonisms. They shared, to some degree, political viewpoints. I think that Salazar was not as rightist as Franco was, but my friend Michael P. says he was not a fascist per se, but Salazar, right? But he had no love for the left, and Franco certainly, So, but I think there's a cultural divide. Just don't go to Portugal and start speaking Spanish. You can speak all the English you want in Portugal, and they love it, but don't say a word in Spanish. Anything else? Yes?
Argentina, Brazil.
You're dying for somebody to add. Tell us about the tie.
I found it. It was in my closet. I had to dig deep, real deep. So, anything else? No? Great. Thank you for coming, folks.